Cursed is the man who trusts in man. Blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord. When I was about 24 years old in St. Louis, I was finally made an account executive of all of St. Louis, and so that meant I would finally be able to get a laptop. Only managers and executives, people who had to work everywhere, got laptops. So here I was in the food court of the Galleria Mall, thinking to myself, very soon I'll be able to answer emails when I'm here. And so I sat down. However, I did have my Bible with me. And so I looked at my Bible and read Psalm 20, where I read, "Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God." And I realized, I was about to trust in chariots and horses, represented by that laptop. Now back then, if you remember, in the late 90s, the desktops took over like half a desk. And so to think that I could be productive anywhere with a laptop seemed like a very exciting thing. But the Lord really helped me out in not trusting in a laptop too much, because when that laptop finally came, to save some money, my manager made sure that I got a used laptop that had been passed around the organization for a while. And I had to bring it back to IT basically every month to make sure it would work, and it never really did work very well. When I finally got a new laptop, I was done with the thing. So we still have to use chariots on occasion. We still have to use horses. Even we still need to use laptops, but we don't trust in them. This illustrates our passage from Jeremiah today. Cursed is the man who trusts in man and makes flesh his strength, whose heart turns away from the Lord. He is like a shrub in the desert, and shall not see any good come. He shall dwell in the parched places of the wilderness, in an inhabited salt land. So here, trusting in man is a metaphor for things that are merely of the earth, things that are worldly. And that can mean trusting in leaders. It can mean trusting in things that men make. It can mean trusting in the approval of others, even our peers. And so what Jeremiah is saying is that this kind of trust is incompatible with trust in the Lord. For he says it indicates those whose heart, he says, turns away from the Lord. Because even as Jesus says, you cannot have two masters. You cannot serve God and mammon, the things of the earth. This doesn't mean that we don't need leaders, that we don't need artifices of the earth, but it's a constant effort to make sure that our trust is in God alone, not the latest laptop or whatever it might be in this day that seems to give us an extra leverage that will make us finally succeed. So the concept here is what we could simply call fear of man. Now, on some level, this is a disordered concern that all of us face in one way or another. As one of my teachers in seminary said, if you don't have fear of man at some point, you don't have a pulse. But when it becomes your modus operandi, your orientation for how you go about life, what you trust in, that's when the scales tip. And that's when, as one of my teachers, Ed Welch, would say, when people become big and God becomes small. And often this happens to us in subtle ways. We enter into this modus operandi hardly even realizing it. And so it might seem that we have two choices before us, focusing on God versus focusing on things of the world, others. But really it's a different choice, because when we're focusing on worrying about things of the earth, the source is our anxiety. If we want things of the world to give us strength, the focus is not so much on others. When you're doing this, our focus is on ourselves. You're focusing on, what do I need in order to be strong enough, in order to succeed, in order to get an edge? When that happens, the focus is on me. And when it happens to you, it's the same thing. It's the same dynamic. But the alternative, when you focus on God, then you're looking at his goodness. You care about his glory. And you want God to be seen in you. Then the focus is no longer on yourself. Anxiety is gone. And that's when you're able to tap into what Jeremiah refers to as the living waters. He says, "Blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord, whose trust is the Lord. He is like a tree planted by water that sends out its roots by the stream and does not fear when heat comes, for its leaves remain green and is not anxious in the year of drought, nor for it does not cease to bear fruit." So when we look up to God and are led by him, when we seek his purposes above all, he leads us to living water. It's like this. If you want to invest in the stock market, right, you're not just caring about short-term gains, stocks that go up for the short term. Ultimately, you're investing in long-term gains, those stocks that will give you returns in the end when you need to cash in on them many years from now. And so if you put your story in his story, all right, if you put your stock in his glory, then you know he wins in the end. Even if in the short term that might mean some challenges or some persecution or some difficulty. So when you invest in God's glory, you're investing, yes, in stock that will last. And so there's a common saying: pray as if it all, rather, work as it. Here's a common saying that is attributed to St. Ignatius of Loyola. In a couple of his biographers explain that this was the basis of St. Ignatius' life. Work as if it all depended upon you. Pray as if it all depended upon God. Now that sounds like you're putting your roots in living waters, if you're praying as if it all depended on God, right? Because we still have to work. We still need means. We still need to live in an incarnate world. Well, if you look online, actually, often this quote is attributed to St. Augustine. If you're not sure who to attribute a quote to, just give it attributed to St. Augustine and everyone will believe you and it'll be all over the internet. But actually, this is something that St. Ignatius of Loyola did not say either. It didn't appear in biographies until some 200 years after his death. And those who know his life realize he didn't say it, and you and I should know that he didn't say it because it's actually not a good quote, even though it's been attributed to John Wesley and many other saints. Because if you work as if it all depended on God, rather, the way the quote goes, if you work as if it all depended on you, and then pray as if it all depended on God, then you're compartmentalizing your work and your prayer. Then you're conceiving that you're actually putting in effort without God in view. It compartmentalizes the two. And that ultimately will lead to you ultimately focusing on the things of the earth, focusing on man one way or another while you work. I'll give you an example of where this went the wrong way, which is an example given by Bishop Conley, the bishop of the Diocese of Lincoln, who recently put out a pastoral letter called A Future with Hope. And in this letter, he talked about how he fell into mental illness. And he wants others to be aware of this trouble and to avoid being stuck in the same. And how did he fall into mental illness? He said that basically he lived just like that quote, falsely attributed to St. Ignatius. He said he was raised to work hard. And when in college he received the faith and became enthusiastic about Christianity, he just changed that to pray and work hard. which was fine except when the heat was turned up as a bishop and his responsibilities were greater. And then he found that he was always so concerned about wanting to serve the people of the diocese so much. He felt so much pressure to perform that the pressure became overwhelming. And as he outlines in great detail in his relatively brief letter, that is what made him break. Eventually, he stopped exercising, and he went to a downward spiral to the point that he could hardly function. And so, reading between the lines, what you can see is fairly clear. Even though he still prayed, his eyes were still on himself. And not only that, he saw other eyes on himself very intensely. And no doubt he's had lawyers and consultants and people at his disposal, but he was not trusting in the Lord through it all. Now, the scope of his letter was limited. He basically wanted to say, yes, take time for the sacraments, take time to rest, take time to care about mental health. But he doesn't fully close the loop. It's just beyond the scope of his letter. He doesn't fully close the loop about how we avoid entering into this peril in the first place. To which we could look at the perspective of George Mueller. If you've ever heard of George Mueller, he was a late 19th century evangelist who started many orphanages, worked very hard, but the witness of his life is that he trusted in God above everything else. He did not even do fundraising. He just trusted that God would supply, and he just prayed that people would give him the finances that he needed, and he was able to support orphanages and missionaries to a great extent just by the simple trust in God. And so here is his quote. He said, "This is one of the great secrets in connection with successful service for the Lord, to work as if everything depended upon our diligence." That sounds a lot like the quote misattributed to St. Ignatius, but then he continues, "And not to rest in the least upon our exertions, but upon the blessing of the Lord." So there's a subtle difference here. While you're working, to not trust for a moment on your own efforts, but only on the Lord working through them. St. Paul, in a very carefully worded statement, writing to the Philippians, gives us a little bit more clarity than that. He says, "Work out your salvation with fear and trembling." But then he says, "For it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure." It's not your strength, it's his strength alone. Trusting in him, those for the living waters. At the end of his life, Mueller was able to say, and he, by the way, continued to work until he was 92, and found that throughout his whole life, he was able to attest that God's yoke is easy and his burden is light. So while we're called to carry the cross, the resurrection is in the cross. Our Lord Jesus Christ went for us and gives us his strength. Now Jesus, in trailblazing for us, in the temptation in the desert, the devil tempted him to trust in man. Say, "I will give you this earth. I will give you all that you want. Just trust in me instead." But Jesus chose the way of the cross during that temptation. But even in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he asked that this burden would be taken off of him, he still trusted that resurrection would come. He had to trust that ultimately he would be raised in his humanity, knowing that it wouldn't depend on him alone. He was waiting for the victory. Even though that he was a part of that Godhead. But St. Paul points out, "I press on to make salvation my own because Christ Jesus has made me his own." He has already made us his own. So our identity is secure in him. All we need to do is to walk in his work. Jesus, how will you be glorified in my life? And when we begin with this question, there's no anxiety, because we have our story in his story, and we have our roots planted in living waters. Psalm 127. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It is vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives to his beloved sleep. So we all at times want a shortcut. We want the leverage that the technology will give us. If it's not a laptop, it might be AI or something else, or someone else who you feel has influence might be able to come to your aid. So yes, we need means. We need watchmen. We might even need chariots on occasion. But if you put God's purposes first, then you will have your roots planted in living waters. And whether you have chariots available or laptops or technology or not, his enabling, his inspiration will enable you to continue. Let us trust in him, for his purposes will win out in the end.